Okay, so acquisition of ownership. How can you become an owner of something? How can you become an owner of a thing? How can you become an owner of property? And there are 11 methods by which you can acquire ownership of a thing that we will discuss today. The most obvious method, like I mentioned in the previous video, is by buying stuff, right? If you buy something, you become the owner. And that falls under transfer, which is the 11th method for today. But we have to start right at the beginning with number 1, acquisition of ownership by inheritance or succession. So an inheritance is basically when something is handed over to you or handed down to you after someone dies. So before someone dies, they write a will and they say, I would like to leave my estate to this person or these people. And then when that person dies, those people acquire ownership of the estate of the dead person. So in the example that I have here, this man, let's call him Mr. Chang. Mr. Chang died and his estate was worth 1.5 million. But he also had debts of 300,000 euros. So he left his estate to his 3 children, these 3 children that you see here. So how does inheritance work? Inheritance works by, first of all, you have to accept the inheritance. So once a person dies and then the will says you have been given a house, you have to either accept or reject. If you reject an inheritance, that is fine. You are allowed to reject an inheritance and then you don't get anything. But if you accept the inheritance, then you accept both the assets and the debts of that person's estate. You cannot only accept the assets. They go together. So in this case, when Mr. Chang died, he left assets of 1.5 and debts of 300,000. That means if all his 3 children accept what he left to them, that means they first have to pay out the debts. That means they only have 1.2 million left, which they split it equally amongst the 3 of them. That means that all of them get 400,000 euros each. And by so doing, they acquire ownership over the estate that is worth 400,000 euros each. That's the first method of acquisition. The second method of acquisition of ownership is by accessio. So accessio, these are obviously Latin words, and you have to remember the Latin words for the exam. So what is accessio? Accessio is basically when a movable thing becomes immovable by attaching it to an immovable thing. For example, this bear here was a sculpture. The sculpture was obviously movable, and because it was attached in a very permanent way to the wall being an immovable thing, the sculpture therefore also becomes immovable, and the owner of the wall therefore becomes the owner of the sculpture, because the principle is that the owner of the prominent thing is the owner of the whole thing. So the wall is the prominent thing. That means the owner of the wall becomes also the owner of the sculpture. Accessio also applies to when a movable thing is attached to another movable thing, which is the prominent object. And for this, I have the example of this wheel here. As you can see in this wheel, you have a tire, you have all the stuff that's there. And then you see over here, you have a screw. There's a little screw right there. In that case, the screw is movable and the wheel is also movable. The owner of the wheel becomes also the owner of the screw. Why? Because of the principle we just explained, that the owner of the prominent object also becomes the owner of the principal thing becomes the owner of the whole thing. So if, for example, there were 2 owners and both of them had contributed in equal parts to the making of this wheel. So let's say someone contributed the rubber and someone contributed this middle iron thing here. then in this case you could argue that they contributed 50-50 towards the making of this will. In that case, they would be co-owners. So both of them would be considered owners of the will. And that is accessio. The third method of acquiring ownership is through commixtio. So commixtio is basically when you mix things together, for example, grains, liquids, and gases. So these things belong to different owners and they create a whole new thing after you mix them. So it's these types of specific kind of things. In this example, I have some chemicals here. And as you can see, the green chemical mixed with the orange chemical to create something yellowish. So the yellowish thing is now a new thing on its own. So in this case, the owner of the yellowish thing is the owner of the orange thing, because judging from this, you could suggest that the owner of the orange thing is the one who owns the prominent object. So the same principle applies. The owner of the prominent thing becomes the owner of the new thing. The fourth method of acquiring ownership is through specificatio. So specificatio is when you make a new movable thing by using other things. So those things could have belonged to other people, but then you use them to create a new thing. So in this example, Mary made this wagon. So as you can see here, she used wheels which she borrowed from John. She used wooden planks, which she got from John. She used wooden planks which she got from her friend Maggie. And she used this sail, this white sail which she got from Jan. And she also used this bench here which she got from Christopher. And then she also used these metal things there that she got from her dad. So as you can see, there are a lot of components that made this wagon. But the wagon itself has become a new thing. How do we know that? We know that because now we are calling it a wagon. We are not calling it wheels, planks, bench, white sail, metal things. We don't call it that anymore. We call it a wagon. It has become one thing. So ownership rights attach to the wagon and not to the individual components of the wagon. So that means that Mary is now the owner of a whole new thing that has been created from other things. Now, let's say Mary had attached one single wheel to an already existing wagon. Then in that case, she wouldn't have made a new thing. So she would not have made a new thing. But her action would have led to an accessio, the previous one, where you attach a movable thing to a movable thing. So in that case, she would not have acquired ownership of the wagon, because the owner of the wagon would have been the owner of the prominent thing. So the prominent thing being the wagon itself. But this is not the case here. This case, she used many components to create a whole new thing. And in this case, we call it specificatio and not accessio. And now the fifth method of acquiring ownership of property. You can acquire ownership of property through what is called occupatio. So occupatio is basically when you pick up something that is movable and that thing clearly belongs to nobody. In Latin, we say it is a res nullius. So a res nullius is something that clearly belongs to no one. In this example, I have This is a can of, oops. Okay, so maybe I should, okay. So in this example, we have a can of Coke, right? So if you saw this lying around on the ground outside, you obviously would assume that the person who disposed of it did not want it anymore. So you can assume that it belongs to no one. In other words, this can of Coke is a res nullius. So when you find a movable res nullius, you simply acquire ownership through occupatio by simply taking it. Because as you can see, it clearly belongs to nobody. So you can immediately become the owner through occupatio. In other words, you can kick it, you can squash it under your feet, you can pick it up and put it on your table as a decoration and put some pens inside. You can do whatever you want to do with it because you are now the owner of a res nullius. Another example of a res nullius, for example, is a stick. If you pick up a stick outside, it is a movable thing that clearly belongs to no one. Birds, the pigeons outside. If you catch a bird, it's a movable thing that clearly belongs to no one. It is a res nullius, and you can become an owner of a res nullius through occupatio. And then we have another example. In this case, if you pick up a movable thing, in this case it's a wallet. If you pick up a wallet, can you honestly assume that it belongs to no one? No, you cannot. A wallet is clearly not a res nullius. So what you need to do in this case is you need to take the wallet to the police station or to the authorities, and then after a certain period of time, if the wallet is not claimed by the true owner, then you may become an owner of this wallet. So remember, occupatio only applies if you picked up something movable which clearly belongs to no one. If it is something which you think can belong to someone, like a wallet, then you have to take it to the police and you may acquire ownership after a certain period of time once the police have established that the thing has no owner. The sixth method of acquiring ownership is through finding. So if you find something, for example, a horse, then you need to hand it over to the police and you have to wait for 1 year. Now, in this case, it's different from Occupatio, because obviously if you found a horse in the middle of the city, there's no way that a horse is a res nullius. There's no way that it clearly belongs to nobody. So it obviously has an owner. What you have to do is you report it to the police, and the police can ask you to hand it over, or they can ask you to keep it while they try and find the owner. So you can take this horse and take it to a stable or a barn, and you ask them to keep it for a while. So legally you're supposed to wait for 1 year. After 1 year, if no one has claimed the horse, then you immediately become an owner of the horse by finding. So you have to wait 1 year. If no one claims the horse, then woohoo, it's all yours after a year. And that means obviously that you then have to pay for the costs that were incurred in keeping this horse at a barn or a stable. So you have to pay for all those 12 months because you become the owner from the time when you found the horse. And now we move on to the third video, where we will continue with the seventh method of acquiring ownership.